4, congruent supplements and complements. After studying this section, you'll be able to prove angles congruent by means of 4 new theorems. So let's look at an example that will lead us to our first theorem. So in the diagram below, angle 1 is supplementary to angle A, and angle 2 is also supplementary to angle A. Now we're given that angle A is 70 degrees. Therefore, angle 1 would be 110 degrees, because 180 minus 70 is 110. Now if 2 is also sup to A, that would make 2 110 degrees. Notice both angle 1 and angle 2 are 110 degrees, making them congruent. So our first theorem, if angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. Now likewise, I have another theorem that involves congruent angles instead of the same angle. So if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Again, because if I have two congruent angles, they will have the same measure. Then if I have two angles that are sup to the same measure, they will be congruent. So if I'm given angle F is sup to angle G, and angle H is sup to angle J, and G is congruent to J, again, if I say G and J are congruent, let's say this is 40 degrees, that would make F and H, because they're sup, both 140 degrees. Therefore, they are congruent. So my second theorem is if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, they are congruent. Now likewise, instead of supplementary, I can have complementary. Remember, complementary means add to 90 degrees. So I have two more theorems. The only word that I change is sup to comp. So if angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. Likewise, theorem 7, if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. So again, I have 4 new theorems here. You need to make sure that you memorize these theorems so you can use them for the homework and for the sample problems. Let's look at our first sample problem. Now I'm given angle 1 is sup to angle 2, angle 3 is sup to angle 4, angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. I want to conclude that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. Now a helpful tip for using these 4 theorems, if I see double sup or double comp, I'm probably going to use one of these 4 theorems. So looking at this, if I mark my diagram, I'm given angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. And then I'm given that 2 and 1 are sup and 3 and 4 are sup. So I can see if I have two angles that are sup to congruent angles, then my angles will be congruent. So that's the proof that I want to do. So I'll lead with my givens. So angle 1 is sup to angle 2, angle 3 is sup to angle 4, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. Now I can conclude that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3 because of one of the theorems that we just did. If two angles are sup to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Now I have a short form. I can say supplements of congruent angles are congruent, but remember we are only using if-then statements currently. We won't use the short forms until Unit 3. So remember to use your conditional statement of if angles are sup to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Looking at problem 2, I'm given angle A is comp to angle C, angle DBC is comp to angle C. What can I conclude? Well, notice I have double comp again, so I'm probably going to use one of the 4 theorems we just learned. If A is comp to C and DBC is comp to C, they're both comp to congruent angles, so angle A is going to be congruent to angle DBC. Now looking at this in a proof, I'm going to have my first 2 givens, so A is comp to C and DBC is comp to C. Because these are comp to congruent angles, I can state that angle A is congruent to angle DBC, with my reasoning being, if angles are comp to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Again, I have a short form. I could say complements of the same angle are congruent. Looking at problem 3, I'm given the diagram as shown. I want to prove that angle HFE is congruent to angle GFJ. So I want to show that this angle is congruent to this angle. Now, if I notice, both of those angles are sup to angle HFG. So if I show that EFH is sup to HFG and JFG is sup to HFG, they are going to be congruent because if two angles are sup to the same angle, then the angles are congruent. So looking at this in my statement reason proof, my first statement should be my given, diagram is shown. Then I'm going to assume from the diagram that angle EFG is a straight angle because I want to show that EFH and HFG are sup. I know if I have a straight angle, then the two angles that form the straight angle make supplementary pair. So angle HFE is sup to angle HFG because if two angles form a straight angle, they are sup. Likewise, I'll do the same exact reasoning for angle JFG and HFG. So I'll say that HFG is a straight angle. That's the same reasoning as 2. Now I can say that angle GFJ and angle HFG are sup. Again, same reasoning as 3. Now notice that I have two angles that are sup to the same angle. Therefore, they're going to be congruent because if two angles are sup to the same angle, they are congruent. So angle HFE is congruent to angle GFJ. If angles are sup to the same angle, then they are congruent. Looking at my last proof, problem 4, I'm given line segment KM is perpendicular to line segment MO. Line segment PO is perpendicular to line segment MO. Angle KMR is congruent to angle POR. I want to prove that angle ROM is congruent to angle RMO. So if I mark my diagram here, my first statement is KM is perpendicular to MO, making this a right angle. PO is perpendicular to MO, making this a right angle. And angle KMR, so this angle, is congruent to angle POR. I want to show that ROM is congruent to RMO. Notice I have two angles that are comp and then two angles that are congruent. So I can state that if angles are comp to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Looking at this in my statement reason proof, I'm going to have my first statement be KM perpendicular to MO. That's given. And then what information can I derive from this statement? Well, I can say that angle KMO is a right angle because if segments are perpendicular, then they form right angles. Now, what else can I say about right angles? Well, I can say that the two angles that form them are complementary. So angle RMO and angle KMR are comp. If two angles form a right angle, then they're comp. Now I can do the same exact reasoning for my right side. So I'm going to say, just in a similar manner, angle ROM is comp to angle POR because of my first three reasons. Now I can state that angle KMR is congruent to POR. That was my given. And now I have my proof statement, angle ROM is congruent to angle RMO, because if angles are comp to congruent angles, then they are congruent. In this lesson, we learned 4 new theorems. Those theorems being, if angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. If angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. If angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. And if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. That's a wrap on this video. We'll see you in the next one.